Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating high-stakes world that sits right at the intersection of human health, cutting-edge innovation, and complex global economics. We are decoding the medical equipment and supplies industry. Now, this is a massive sector. It impacts literally almost every single person on the planet at some point in their lives. And yet, the mechanisms of how it actually operates, how it's priced, and how its safety is regulated can kind of feel like a black box. So today, we're opening that box, and we're going to rely strictly on the rigorous framework of the SASB Sustainability Accounting Standards to do it.
Here's a quick roadmap of what we're covering today. First, defining the industry. Then, growth and pressures, affordability and safety, ethics and marketing, and finally, life cycle and supply chain.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, Defining Medical Equipment and Supplies.
To start, according to the Sustainable Industry Classification System, or SICS, this industry is officially coded as HCMS. Simply put, it's defined as an industry that researches, develops, and produces medical, surgical, dental, ophthalmic, and veterinary instruments and devices. It's super important to ground ourselves in this definition because it just goes to show how incredibly broad this umbrella really is, spanning everything from human eye care all the way to veterinary surgeries.
And to really illustrate the sheer scope of products manufactured within this space, you just have to look at the extremes. On one hand, you have your simple, low-cost disposable items, things like scalpels, latex gloves, basic thermometers. But then, on the exact same spectrum, the industry scales all the way up to highly specialized, advanced, high-value machines. Think MRI scanners, or those insanely advanced robotic surgery devices. The exact same industry standard applies to the whole shebang.
So who's actually relying on these vital tools every single day? Well, the primary end users are hospitals, clinics, and laboratories. These are the absolute frontline facilities using these products to save lives, perform critical diagnostic tests, and conduct groundbreaking research. Honestly, without this industry, modern healthcare as we know it simply ceases to function.
Moving right along to Section 2, Drivers of Industry Growth.
There's a really fascinating economic tension happening right now in this space. On one side of the equation, you have these massive opportunities for global growth, an aging population, an increase in diseases linked to unhealthy lifestyles, booming emerging markets, and the expansion of health insurance access. Naturally, all of that drives up demand. But that demand is colliding head-on with intense downward pricing pressure. Governments are expanding insurance, sure, but they're also demanding regulatory cost reductions. And at the exact same time, healthcare providers and payers are consolidating, which basically gives them way more power to negotiate lower prices. So companies in this space are walking a real tightrope to balance these opposing forces and maintain their profit margins.
To figure out how companies are actually managing these complex risks and opportunities, we evaluate them through the authoritative lens of the SASB standards, which are now part of the IFSS Foundation. Basically, these standards dictate exactly what sustainability metrics companies should be disclosing to investors. And look, this isn't just some boring compliance exercise. It's about revealing a company's strategic resilience, covering everything from pricing transparency all the way down to supply chain audits.
Which brings us to Section 3, Affordability and Product Safety. This is where we pivot to the human element. How do we ensure a profit-driven industry stays accountable to the patients? Well, it starts with affordability. The standard requires companies to track the annualized percentage change in two very different pricing metrics. The list price, which is basically the wholesale cost, and the net price, which subtracts all the rebates, discounts, and returns. Tracking both is absolutely vital because it reveals the true affordability of these products. It lets investors see whether price increases actually reflect what customers are paying at the end of the day, and how well a company might weather those downward pricing pressures we just talked about.
And that level of accountability extends directly into product safety. A massive metric here is the total number of units recalled. Now, this isn't just a dry administrative number on a spreadsheet. When medical devices are recalled because of adverse health consequences, it represents millions of dollars lost in revenue and remediation costs. But far more importantly, it represents a very real potential danger to human life. So companies must explicitly disclose whether these recalls were voluntary or if they were forced by regulatory authorities.
Which naturally leads us to the gravest metric of all, the number of fatalities associated with a company's products. This adds serious weight to why strict safety monitoring is completely non-negotiable. If a design flaw or a manufacturing defect actually leads to a loss of life, the financial and reputational implications for that company are catastrophic, not to mention the tragic human cost. This metric is what keeps companies accountable to the highest possible safety standards.
Now, to prevent those absolute worst-case scenarios, regulators heavily monitor good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. When facilities fail to meet these standards, the enforcement actions are incredibly swift and severe. We're talking an escalation from non-compliance violations and warning letters straight up to product seizures, mandated recalls, and consent decrees. Companies are required to disclose the exact number and type of these actions, plus the corrective measures they're actively taking to fix the underlying issues.
Okay, let's look at Section 4, Ethics and Marketing Practices.
So, we know how the products are made and priced, but how are they actually sold? Medical equipment companies spend a fortune marketing directly to consumers and physicians, but a huge risk pops up with what's called off-label promotion. That's when you market a device for a use that hasn't officially been approved by regulators. Companies must publicly disclose their codes of ethics governing this exact practice, because honestly, illegal off-label marketing claims have historically led to massive monetary losses through legal battles, fines, and settlements.
On top of that, the whole industry is subject to incredibly strict healthcare fraud and abuse laws. Companies have to meticulously track and disclose any monetary losses that come from legal proceedings tied to bribery or corruption. They also have to be fully transparent about their rules for how their sales teams interact with healthcare professionals. This covers everything: the rules around providing food, entertainment, training, or education to the doctors, the purchasing agents, and the practice managers who ultimately hold the power to decide which products to buy.
Finally, we've reached Section 5, Life Cycle and Supply Chain.
We've covered the economics, the human impact, and the ethics. Now for the Earth element. There is a huge, growing push for sustainability in healthcare right now. Companies are increasingly expected to manage the end-of-life disposal of their products. In fact, they're required to report exactly how many metric tons of products they recover, reuse, recycle, or donate. And they have to break this down into two distinct categories: the high-value devices and equipment versus the lower-cost supplies. This product take-back strategy is crucial for managing environmental concerns around toxicity and waste, all while meeting a rising consumer demand for sustainable practices.
But here's the catch. Before a product can be taken back, it has to be tracked. And maintaining absolute traceability of a medical product requires a brilliant multi-step process. Companies have to track identifying info like production dates and locations, starting all the way back at raw material sourcing, through production, point of delivery, retail, and transportation logistics. They use things like barcodes, chain of custody audits, or RFID tags to make this happen. And it's essential, because if a safety issue suddenly arises, a company needs to know exactly where every single compromised unit is located, literally instantly.
And right at the very beginning of that complex supply chain is the sourcing of raw materials. The standard requires full disclosure on how companies are managing the risks associated with critical materials. We're talking about materials that are absolutely essential for advanced medical equipment but are subject to severe supply restrictions, things like cobalt, rare earth elements, and platinum group metals. These materials carry super high physical, geopolitical, and price volatility risks, so companies have to explain exactly how they mitigate those risks, whether that's by diversifying their suppliers, stockpiling, or heavily investing in new recycling technologies.
So what does this all mean for the future? How will the medical equipment industry balance this insanely rapid, high-tech innovation with safe, ethical accessibility? We've seen just how massive this sector is, the intense pricing pressures it faces, the rigid safety demands, and the wildly complex supply chains. Balancing the drive for profit and innovation with the fundamental human right to safe, affordable healthcare, well, that's the ultimate challenge for this industry moving forward. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in The Explainer. Keep learning, stay focused, and I'll catch you next time.